That was a quiet Friday afternoon in Lincoln Heights, a small but bustling town where the whispers of racial tension often lingered beneath the surface. Officer Bradley Kane, a seasoned cop with a reputation that sparked as much fear as respect, leaned against his squad car outside the courthouse. His eyes scanned the street like a hawk searching for prey. He wasn't just a man in uniform. He was an authority who rarely questioned his own sense of justice, or lack of it. A sudden roar of an engine pulled Bradley's attention. A sleek black SUV glided into the courthouse parking lot. As the door opened, a sharply dressed black man in his mid-40s stepped out, his posture commanding yet calm. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the scuffed boots and creased uniforms of the officers scattered nearby. He carried a briefcase, but it might as well have been a badge of power. Bradley's lip curled as he sized up the man. Another one thinking he's above the law, he muttered under his breath, tugging at the brim of his hat. Without hesitation, he approached. "Sir," Bradley said sharply, stepping into the man's path. "What's your business here?" The man's eyes flicked toward Bradley, calm and unbothered, as if he faced this kind of scrutiny 100 times before. "I have an appointment," he said simply, his voice smooth and measured. "An appointment," Bradley repeated, his tone thick with skepticism. "In court? What are you, some kind of lawyer?" The man smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. Something like that. But Bradley wasn't the kind to let things slide. His gut had already made up its mind about this man, and his instincts, or biases, had rarely gone unchallenged in Lincoln Heights. "Mind if I see some ID?" Bradley asked, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. The man paused, his gaze locking onto Bradley's. For a moment, the air between them grew taut, heavy with unspoken words. Slowly, the man reached into his pocket, pulling out a leather wallet and handing over his ID. Bradley studied it, his brow furrowing. "William Carter," Bradley read aloud, his tone skeptical. "Federal prosecutor. Is that supposed to impress me?" "Not particularly," William said, his tone still maddeningly calm. "But it's accurate." Bradley's jaw tightened. He handed the ID back roughly, as if the mere act of touching it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Well, Mr. Carter, don't think for a second that your title gives you special treatment here. In my town, everyone follows the rules. I wouldn't expect anything less." William said, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. He stepped past Bradley, heading toward the courthouse steps. But Bradley wasn't done. Something about William's confidence, his unshakable composure, gnawed at him. He wasn't just a man doing his job. He was a challenge, a disruption to the unspoken order of things. And Bradley didn't take kindly to disruptions. The courtroom was already buzzing when William entered, his presence drawing curious glances from those who knew who he was and those who didn't. Bradley followed a few steps behind, his eyes never leaving William's back. As the judge called the session to order, Bradley found himself unable to shake the feeling that something was off. He didn't trust this man, and he didn't like the way the room seemed to subtly shift in his favor. What Bradley didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the next 5 minutes would change everything. Because William Carter wasn't just another name on a docket, another face in the crowd. He was a man with power, with purpose. And before the day was over, Bradley Kane would find himself standing on the wrong side of justice in a way he never saw coming. The story was just beginning. The courtroom felt colder than usual, or maybe that was just Bradley's nerves beginning to catch up with him. He shifted in his seat near the back, arms crossed tightly as he watched William Carter take his place near the front. The man didn't fidget. He didn't glance at his phone or tap his foot impatiently like others around him. He just sat there, calm and collected, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Bradley's eyes narrowed. He hated how William looked so at ease, as if the entire system worked in his favor. There was something unsettling about it, like William knew something the rest of them didn't. The judge entered, and everyone rose, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. Bradley noticed how the judge's eyes flicked to William. A brief nod exchanged between them. a silent acknowledgement. Bradley recognized that kind of look. It wasn't the glance most people got from a judge, it was respect. The kind of respect you earn through years of being untouchable. As everyone settled back into their seats, the first case was called. A minor land dispute, nothing that should have held Bradley's attention, but he found himself stealing glances at William every few minutes. It wasn't until halfway through the hearing that William finally stood, stepping forward with a legal pad tucked under his arm. "Your Honor," William began, his voice steady but not overly loud. The room shifted ever so slightly in his direction. "Before we proceed further, I'd like to bring attention to a matter involving procedural errors in the prosecution's evidence." Bradley sat forward just a little, his eyes narrowing. William's words were sharp but polite, dismantling the opposing counsel's argument piece by piece. It wasn't flashy. He didn't shout or grandstand. He just spoke with a quiet authority that left no room for debate. The judge listened carefully, nodding along, while the other attorneys struggled to recover. Bradley's grip tightened around the edge of the wooden bench. This wasn't what he expected. He thought William would be arrogant or overconfident, the kind of man who let his title do the talking. But this was something different. Calculated, controlled. When the hearing paused for a recess, Bradley found himself following William outside, staying a few steps behind him. William leaned against one of the tall marble columns near the entrance, flipping through papers without so much as a glance around. "Nice little performance in there," Bradley said, his voice low but just loud enough to cut through the hum of people passing by. William's eyes lifted from his papers, meeting Bradley's gaze with that same unreadable calm. "It's not a performance," he replied, slipping the papers back into his briefcase. "It's my job." "Funny," Bradley muttered, stepping closer. "You don't seem like the usual type we see around here." William's brow lifted slightly, but he didn't respond right away. There was a pause, one Bradley couldn't quite decipher. "I take it you mean that as a compliment," William said finally, his tone light but pointed. Bradley's smirk faded. Before he could respond, the courthouse doors opened, and a few attorneys filtered out, nodding in William's direction as they passed. Bradley noticed how they all seemed to recognize him. "You've been here before," Bradley said, more a statement than a question. "Many times," William replied without hesitation. "Lincoln Heights is part of my jurisdiction." Bradley felt his jaw tighten again. He didn't like the way William said it, as if the town itself fell under his control. But before Bradley could dig further, the judge stepped out onto the front steps, her gaze briefly meeting William's. She gave a small wave, and William nodded in return. That was the second time Bradley had caught the exchange, and it only made the feeling in his gut twist tighter. "You and the judge seem familiar," Bradley said carefully. William's lips pressed into a thin smile. "I imagine you'd want to be familiar with the federal prosecutor overseeing major cases in your district too," he replied, his tone never shifting. Bradley's stomach sank. He'd heard the name William Carter before, but hadn't connected it until now. William wasn't just any prosecutor. He was a prosecutor, the one people whispered about when high-profile cases were at risk of unraveling. Bradley swallowed hard, trying to hide the sudden wave of unease washing over him. "Enjoy your afternoon," Officer Kane, William said smoothly, already turning back toward the entrance. Bradley stood there frozen, watching William disappear back inside. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Bradley realized his palms were damp, and he rubbed them against his pants, irritated at himself for feeling rattled. It wasn't over. He told himself that. William Carter might have the title, but Bradley had something else: time. And he wasn't about to let some big-shot prosecutor come into his town and act like he ran the place. As the courthouse doors swung shut behind William, Bradley's mind was already working, piecing things together, searching for the cracks. Because everyone had cracks. And Bradley was determined to find his. The rest of Bradley's day felt unusually long. His shift ended hours ago, but he found himself lingering near the station, leaning against his cruiser and watching the courthouse parking lot from across the street. There was no reason for him to still be here, but something about William Carter's calm confidence dug under his skin like a splinter he couldn't ignore. A few officers passed by, tossing casual greetings his way, but Bradley barely acknowledged them. His eyes stayed locked on the courthouse entrance. People drifted in and out, but there was no sign of William. As the sun dipped lower, Bradley finally caught sight of him emerging through the heavy doors. William walked with the same steady pace as before, briefcase in hand, barely noticing the world around him. Bradley straightened, but he didn't approach this time. Instead, he just watched, his hands resting on his belt. William paused near his SUV, pulling out his phone. A few words into the call, he laughed lightly at something, his expression softening just for a moment. The sound carried faintly across the lot, and Bradley felt a strange tug in his chest, an irritation he couldn't explain. As William ended the call and slipped into his vehicle, Bradley's thoughts churned. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just getting started. The next morning, Bradley dug through the system. It wasn't exactly standard protocol, but being a cop in a small town had its perks, access for one. He sifted through records, looking for any reason William Carter's name might have crossed into Lincoln Heights before. Nothing. No traffic violations, no disputes, no personal ties that stood out. It didn't sit right. By noon, Bradley was at the diner, drinking his second cup of coffee and scrolling through local case files on his phone when Officer Rick Turner slid into the booth across from him. Rick was younger, still new enough to the force to be eager, but not sharp enough to notice when he was in over his head. "Brad," Rick said, leaning in with a smirk. "Heard you had a run-in with that prosecutor yesterday. Can't say I envy you. That guy's a legend." Bradley's eyes lifted slowly. "A legend, huh?" Rick nodded. "Took down a whole corruption ring in Millstone last year. 5 officers caught in the sweep. They say he doesn't miss much. It's why the big cases land in his lap." Bradley leaned back, setting his cup down with a little more force than necessary. "Yeah, well, legends are just men when you strip the title away," Bradley muttered, but Rick didn't seem to catch the edge in his tone. Rick laughed, shaking his head. "Still, I keep your head low. Guys like him don't play around. You wouldn't want to end up on his radar." Bradley's stomach twisted at the suggestion. It was later that afternoon when Bradley found himself driving past Lincoln Heights Elementary, catching a glimpse of kids flooding out for recess. He almost kept going until his eyes landed on a familiar figure standing near the playground fence. William. Bradley slowed, pulling to the curb just down the street. William stood with a woman, who Bradley guessed was a teacher, and a boy who couldn't have been more than 10. The boy looked up at William with wide, curious eyes, and William crouched down to his level, ruffling his hair lightly. Bradley hadn't expected that. As William straightened, the woman touched his arm briefly, and Bradley saw that same faint smile cross William's face. But when William glanced toward the street, his eyes caught Bradley's. For a second, neither of them moved. Then William gave a small, polite nod and returned his attention to the boy. Bradley, gripping the wheel tighter, let the car idle a little longer before driving off. By the time evening rolled around, Bradley found himself pacing the station parking lot, unable to shake the knot twisting tighter in his chest. He couldn't figure out why William bothered him so much. Maybe it was the ease with which he navigated places like Lincoln Heights, as if nothing fazed him. Or maybe it was something deeper, something Bradley didn't want to admit. Later that night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Bradley sifted through old news articles about Millstone's corruption case. William's name was everywhere: interviews, public statements, courtroom victories. He was the kind of prosecutor who didn't just take down criminals, but dismantled systems that protected them. Bradley's eyes lingered on a photo of William shaking hands with a federal judge, both smiling, standing in front of the courthouse in Millstone. He wondered how many officers like him William had crossed paths with, how many Bradley Canes had stood in his way. The next morning, Bradley sat quietly in his squad car outside the station, watching the town slowly wake up. He didn't know where things were headed, but one thing was certain: William Carter wasn't just passing through. and Bradley couldn't decide if that was a good thing or not. Bradley's routine began to shift, though he'd never admit it. His patrol routes conveniently looped by the courthouse more often, and if William Carter's SUV happened to be parked out front, Bradley found reasons to linger. It wasn't even about catching William doing something wrong anymore. It was more like Bradley was waiting for something to make sense, some explanation for why this man unsettled him so deeply. The strange thing was, William never seemed to be in a hurry. Bradley watched him leave the courthouse some afternoons, standing on the steps like he had all the time in the world. Sometimes he paused to speak with clerks or attorneys, his briefcase dangling from one hand. Other times he walked straight to his car without acknowledging anyone. It was impossible to get a read on him. Bradley wasn't sure if that calm demeanor was confidence or something else entirely. But whatever it was, it made him feel like he was falling behind. Like William was 2 steps ahead in a game Bradley didn't even know he was playing. One evening, Bradley sat alone in his cruiser near the park, watching as the streetlights flickered on. The town was quiet, the soft hum of distant traffic barely noticeable. His radio crackled with dispatch chatter, but nothing required his attention. He caught himself staring out at the playground, remembering the day he saw William with the boy. Something about that image stuck with him. Bradley had assumed William was married or at least had family nearby. But so far, no one else ever showed up at the courthouse with him. The kid had to mean something to him. Bradley leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel, trying to shake the thought loose. His phone buzzed against the dashboard, and he glanced at the screen. Rick's name flashed across it. Bradley let it ring twice before answering. "Yeah," Bradley muttered. "Brad, you still at the station?" Rick's voice was light but cautious, like he was testing the waters. "No. What's up?" There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling faintly in the background. "Judge Caldwell's asking about you." Bradley's jaw tightened. "Why?" Rick hesitated. "Not sure, but you might want to watch yourself. Word is William Carter's been meeting with her after hours. Could be nothing, but you know how it looks." Bradley sat up straighter, his grip tightening around the phone. It wasn't the first time someone had implied he might be under scrutiny, but hearing William's name attached to it twisted the knife a little deeper. "Yeah, got it," Bradley said, keeping his voice even. He ended the call before Rick could add anything else. For the rest of the evening, Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath his feet, like the ground was cracking, and he didn't know how far the drop would be. A few days passed without incident. Bradley kept his head low, following his usual routine. He still watched William from a distance. There was no confrontation, nothing suspicious. But then, on a crisp Thursday morning, Bradley's chance encounter finally came. He was grabbing coffee at the corner cafe when William walked in, the doorbell chiming softly as he stepped inside. The cafe wasn't busy, just a few locals scattered across the room, quietly reading or chatting. Bradley stood by the counter, his fingers curling around the coffee cup as he watched William approach the barista. "Morning," William greeted with a polite nod. Bradley shifted, clearing his throat just loud enough to be noticed. William's eyes flicked over, catching sight of him for the first time. There was no surprise, just a brief acknowledgement, as if he expected Bradley to be there. Bradley took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch. William placed his order, then casually walked over, standing beside Bradley as they waited. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The air felt heavier than it should have. "Seems like you've been busy around town," Bradley finally said, keeping his voice neutral. William glanced over, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just doing my job." "Funny," Bradley replied, his gaze lingering on him. "Your job seems to overlap with mine a lot." William didn't respond right away. His coffee was placed on the counter, and he took it with a quiet thank you before turning back to Bradley. "Maybe that's because we're both interested in the same thing," William said evenly, taking a sip. Bradley narrowed his eyes slightly. "And what's that?" William's gaze didn't waver. "Justice." The word hung in the air between them, heavier than Bradley expected. Before Bradley could respond, William stepped past him, heading toward the exit without looking back. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Bradley standing there with his half-empty cup and a gnawing sense that whatever was coming, whatever had been building for weeks, was getting closer. Bradley didn't know how this ended, but he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet.